On April 19, 2026, something unprecedented happened. The world's most important shipping lane was closed for the second time in 24 hours, and American negotiators were boarding a plane for Pakistan tonight. Not tomorrow, tonight. Here's why that matters more than anything else you will read today. Hello and welcome. I am Rick Orban, and you have started watching The Truth Global. It is April 19th, 2026, and the world is holding its breath. A fragile ceasefire between the United States and Iran, brokered by Pakistan just 11 days ago, is set to expire in 72 hours. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which 20% of the world's traded oil flows, has been closed again. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has declared it will stay shut until the United States lifts its naval blockade of Iranian ports. And in Washington, President Trump has just posted on Truth Social that his representatives are flying back to Islamabad tonight. Not tomorrow, tonight. This is not a slow-moving diplomatic story. This is an escalation cycle playing out in real time. And almost nobody understands just how interconnected these pressure points are. Because while the world watches Iran, North Korea just fired its 7th ballistic missile test of the year, and a ceasefire in Lebanon is already unraveling. What you are about to hear is not speculation. It is the story of how the world arrived at this moment and what happens if the next 72 hours go wrong. Stay with us. To understand today, you must go back to February 28, 2026, the day the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury. Coordinated airstrikes targeted Iran's military installations, nuclear sites, and leadership infrastructure. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed. Iran retaliated with missiles and drones against Israel, American military bases, and U.S. allied Gulf states. And then, Tehran did something that shook the global economy to its core. It closed the Strait of Hormuz. Shipping firms suspended operations almost immediately. War risk insurance premiums for vessels approaching the strait jumped overnight. Oil prices soared. What had been a regional war between two military powers became a crisis felt in supermarkets and petrol stations from London to Jakarta. The war that hawks in Washington had long theorized about had finally arrived, and its consequences were immediate, global, and deeply destabilizing. This was not happening in isolation. Iran had spent years preparing precisely for this scenario, stockpiling enriched uranium, mining the strait, and building leverage through its network of regional proxies. The closure of the Hormuz was not a desperate act of a cornered state. It was a calculated move. When both the United States and Iran needed a back channel, they turned to Islamabad. Pakistan's intervention was not accidental. For weeks, Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and Army Chief Field Marshal Asim Munir had been working quietly, pulling in Egypt, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and China to support a ceasefire framework before presenting it to both sides. On April 8, 2026, after weeks of frantic diplomacy, Pakistan secured the impossible, a 2-week ceasefire between the US and Iran. 3 days later, Islamabad became the setting for the most significant diplomatic meeting since the 1979 Islamic Revolution, the first direct face-to-face negotiations between Washington and Tehran in over 4 decades. The United States sent a delegation of 300 people, led by Vice President J.D. Vance, alongside special envoys Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. Iran sent 70 officials, led by Parliamentary Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf and Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. Pakistani fighter jets provided air cover for the Iranian delegation's flight. The talks lasted 21 hours across 3 rounds. The first indirect, the second and third direct. When Vance walked out on April 12th without a deal, he was blunt. Iran had not given the fundamental commitment Washington required on nuclear weapons. Iran's delegation, for its part, said the problem was simple: a sea of mistrust that no single session of talks could bridge. At the heart of this standoff sits one of the most consequential waterways on Earth. The Strait of Hormuz is approximately 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. Through it flows roughly a fifth of all traded oil on the planet, and about 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas. Iran has turned it into a weapon. Since the war began, Iran's IRGC has conducted at least 21 confirmed attacks on merchant vessels in and around the strait. It has laid sea mines, some of which, according to U.S. Central Command, Iran itself subsequently lost track of, requiring American naval forces to begin mine clearance operations. On April 12th, after the Islamabad Talks collapsed, President Trump declared a U.S. naval blockade of the strait, stating that the Navy would prevent ships from entering or exiting Iranian ports, specifically while maintaining general freedom of navigation for others. Iran's response was predictable and immediate. The IRGC declared the U.S. blockade constituted acts of piracy. On April 18th, just hours after Iran had reopened the strait, triggering a brief rally in oil markets and a corresponding drop in oil prices, Tehran closed it again. Indian-flagged vessels were fired upon by IRGC gunboats. India summoned the Iranian ambassador in protest. The opening and closing of this waterway has become the most volatile economic lever in the world, and as of this morning, it remains shut. At the same time that Iranian gunboats were patrolling the strait and the ceasefire clock was counting down, something significant was happening behind closed doors. Pakistan's senior military officials, including Army Chief Asim Munir, had visited Tehran. New U.S. proposals were delivered to Iran through Pakistani intermediaries, and according to reporting from Middle East Eye and Tribune, Tehran confirmed it was reviewing those proposals. Then, on April 19th, President Trump posted on Truth Social that his representatives were heading back to Islamabad. Not next week, tonight. This was not a casual diplomatic statement. It was the kind of announcement that carries the weight of urgency. Pakistani officials, meanwhile, had been actively framing these ongoing engagements as part of a broader Islamabad process, a deliberate effort to institutionalize Pakistan's role as the indispensable mediator between two nuclear-capable states with no diplomatic relations. Trump characteristically struck an optimistic tone. He told reporters that very good talks were underway and that a deal was coming, one way or another, the nice way or the hard way. Iran's chief negotiator was considerably less confident, saying the two sides remained, in his words, far from an agreement, while Iran said no date had yet been set for a formal second round of talks. The gap between Washington's optimism and Tehran's caution has become one of the defining features of this entire crisis. Elsewhere, on the other side of the world, a very different nuclear calculation was playing out. At 6:10 in the morning on April 19, South Korean and Japanese defense officials detected multiple ballistic missile launches from the coastal city of Sinpo on North Korea's east coast. The missiles flew approximately 140 kilometers before falling near the Sea of Japan. This was North Korea's fourth missile launch in April alone, and its seventh of the entire year. The timing was not coincidental. Experts and former South Korean officials have noted explicitly that Pyongyang is watching what is happening to Iran with acute attention. Iran, a state that pursued a nuclear deterrent but never fully achieved one, has been subjected to 7 weeks of devastating strikes from the world's foremost military power. North Korea, which has firmly crossed the nuclear threshold and possesses an estimated 50 warheads, is drawing a lesson from this. As one South Korean former presidential security advisor stated, the missile launches may be a way of showing that, unlike Iran, we have self-defense capabilities. This is where things connect. The U.S.-Israeli campaign against Iran has a stated objective of eliminating Tehran's nuclear program. The IAEA chief confirmed this week that North Korea has made very serious advances in its own nuclear capabilities. Pyongyang appears to be using the Iran war as an opportunity to demonstrate deterrence, to signal to Washington ahead of a potential Trump visit to Asia in May and possible talks with Kim Jong-un that what is happening to Iran will not happen to North Korea. The Islamabad talks failed in part because of Lebanon. Tehran's position was, and remains, that any ceasefire agreement must include the war in Lebanon. Israel, however, has refused to halt its offensive against Hezbollah. The United States, bound by its commitment to Israel, has not forced the issue. When Pakistan's Prime Minister Sharif first announced the ceasefire on April 8th, his statement included Lebanon. Washington and Jerusalem quickly removed it from the text. Within 24 hours of a fragile ceasefire agreement between Israel and Lebanon announced on April 18th, French President Emmanuel Macron accused Hezbollah of killing a French UN peacekeeper in southern Lebanon, Sergeant Chef Florian Montorio of the 17th Parachute Engineer Regiment. 3 additional French soldiers were wounded. Meanwhile, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu declared that Israel would maintain an expanded 10-kilometer deep security buffer zone in southern Lebanon, and that any further talks would hinge on Hezbollah's disarmament. Netanyahu is himself contending with a domestic political crisis. An Israeli court canceled his testimony in his criminal corruption trial for this week under the extraordinary circumstances of an ongoing war. Pope Leo has called publicly for weapons to fall silent. The new pontiff decried what he described as a ramp-up in the Ukraine war in the same breath, underscoring the degree to which simultaneous, interlocking conflicts are straining the architecture of international diplomacy. There is no single crisis here. There is a system of crises, each connected to the others, each capable of pulling the others into escalation. Here is the situation as it stands on April 19th, 2026. The ceasefire expires in 72 hours. U.S. negotiators are flying to Islamabad tonight under urgent conditions. Iran is reviewing new American proposals but has set no date for talks. The Strait of Hormuz is closed. The United States Navy is preparing to board and seize Iran-linked vessels. North Korea has fired its 7th missile of the year. Lebanon is a tinderbox. And no party, not Washington, not Tehran, not Islamabad, has publicly committed to a viable path to peace. What happens in the next 3 days matters enormously, not just for the Middle East, but for the global economy, for the nuclear non-proliferation architecture, and for the credibility of American coercive diplomacy itself. If a deal is reached, it will be the most consequential diplomatic achievement since the end of the Cold War. If it fails, the US and Iran return to open conflict. The Strait of Hormuz remains shut. Oil prices spike further, and the world confronts the possibility that a nuclear deal, the very thing the war was ostensibly designed to force, becomes permanently unachievable. Iran's chief negotiator said it plainly: the gap is still large. But Trump said a deal will happen, one way or another. Both cannot be right. And in 72 hours, we will know which one was closer to the truth. Watch this space. And if you want to understand how we got here and what comes next, subscribe and hit the notification bell. This story is not over.